Hello everyone, you are all very welcome to our first Link and Learn of 2025, which has proven to be a very popular topic to kick off the year. My name is Dave Farley, Head of Membership Services at Learnovate, and I have the pleasure of being your host today. Before we get into today's topic, I would like to remind you of a couple of tools to ensure this event is as inclusive and collaborative as possible. Please use the option to add subtitles if required. Simply click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions in the chat on the right, and my Learnovate colleagues, as well as our speakers, are available to have a conversation. We are running a poll in relation to today's topic, which you can view by clicking polls on the right of your screen. We've asked people, how familiar are you with the European Accessibility Act? We ran the same poll on our LinkedIn for the last week. If you're not following us already, please do. The link to some interesting results is in the chat on the right. It looks like there's a real mix of familiarity with the European Accessibility Act. Thankfully, we will be covering it in depth today with a fantastic range of experts. We have a great lineup of experts for today's event. Shortly, we will be joined by Gavin Henrick, CEO of Brickfield Labs, for our keynote. We will then have our panel discussion, which will be chaired by Joanne Banks, Assistant Professor, Inclusive Education, Trinity College, Dublin. Joanne will be joined by Dr. Reale, Assistant Professor in Academic Practice, Immaculate College, Fran Heathorn, Creative Lead, Cobblestone Learning, and Margaret Flood, Assistant Professor, Inclusive Education, Maynooth University. Before we kick off with our keynote, I just want to take a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit more about Learnovate and what we do. Learnovate is an Enterprise Ireland IDA-funded technology centre hosted by Trinity College Dublin, with over 14 years of industry-led research on the future of work and learning. As a centre, we have two key objectives: one, to be membership-led, and two, to have research impact. Our membership continues to grow. We have a diverse range of members from the worlds of schools, K-12, third level higher education, corporate L&D, government departments, government agencies, not-for-profit organisations, social enterprises, and startup organisations. We have a three-tiered membership model, as you can see on screen, with patron, contributor, and learner levels of membership. We have an entry point of membership for any size organisation, and all of our members access our research, our events, and our community. Our contributor and patron members get very involved in the research agenda at Learnovate and co-create the research with the Learnovate research team. Our research agenda has 4 pillars on the future of work and learning. You can see here on screen a current view of our research agenda, which continues to pivot based on industry feedback, because all of our research, as I said, is industry-led. We have research on transversal skills, personalization, accelerated digital transformation, and the learner in the future of work. There's a huge focus on Gen AI research at the moment and the impact on education and learning. If you would like to hear more, please do let me know. We place a huge focus on industry engagement with an annual calendar of events, including exclusive member-only events. We continuously output thought leadership and insights, examples being our monthly Inside Learning podcast, our monthly Momentum newsletter, and our annual Learning Signals survey. Over the past number of months, we've been partnering with Leaders for Accessibility on a bespoke piece of research which is aligned with today's topic. Our research question is, to what extent is accessibility an influencing factor on the effectiveness of corporate learning environments. We welcome expressions of interest in participating in this research. Please get in touch if you would like to hear more about the project and indeed becoming a member of the growing Learnovate global community. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Gavin Henrick to the stage for our keynote. Welcome, Gavin, and over to you.
Hi, Dave. Thank you very much for that. That's awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Gavin Henrick. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Brickfield Education Labs. Been working in education technology for a while. I'm going to screen share and show you a presentation now and go through some information about disability, accessibility, barriers, and the EAA. So bear with me while I screen share. Share screen. So for those who are familiar with PowerPoint and Office 365, you may have seen this before, but this is just one of the ways that we do accessibility when we're presenting. If with your phone you want to scan that QR code briefly, it will then provide you a copy of our slides as we are going through it with a full transcript and a translation below it as well. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to do that, and hopefully that should be fine. And if someone can drop that URL into the chat as well, that would be great for people if they want to as well. And just while you're doing this, accessibility is how we work, how we create, how we engage, how we share. And this is just an example of that. So everyone seems to be going there now. So let's continue on. At Brickfield, we try to imagine a world where learning is accessible to all. And that's a big goal. And this presentation is targeting part of that, which is inclusive education by design. And that means having everybody included, having that learning accessible to all. And all of this feeds into how you're going to view the European Accessibility Act. But what does accessible mean? So this is a quote from a joint letter from 2 US State Departments 14 years ago, maybe 15 now. And it was that accessibility is where a person with a disability can acquire the same information. Now, same information, not a subset, not a summary, but it's the same information. So whether they're acquiring it by listening or reading or using Braille, it's the same information. That they can engage in the same interaction. So you can comment here, you can ask questions, but also if you email me afterwards, I will answer a question privately if you'd rather not answer it in open. So it's the same interactions. So overall, then the same service. This webinar, it's great that Learnovate's using a system that provides captions and with the recording afterwards. This removes those barriers. But it's so that a person with a disability can do these in an equally effective, equally integrated manner. We don't know if any of you have disabilities or if you have any particular situational barriers. Are you listening in a very loud area so you can't hear the audio, so you need the captions, or you're listening in a quiet area so you can't listen to the audio, so you're using captions. So they can do all of this with a substantially equivalent ease of use as a person without a disability. This is truly learning accessible to all. And when you take into account, well, where does this come from and where's the background? You have this concept of universal design. Ron Mace in the Reale world was looking at having design being usable by all people to the greatest extent possible. And it isn't that I'm reading slides, I want to focus on these, that it's the greatest extent possible. Sometimes it's not possible and you have to have an alternate option. But to the greatest extent possible is the goal without the need for adaptation. And his background was in design, and he was also involved in some of the legislation that went on in the States. But the underlying principle is everyone, every person can experience barriers, reduced functionality or some form of disability, temporary or permanent, at some stage in life. So this isn't about supporting 1, 2, 5, 10, 20% of people. It's about supporting everyone. And that's really important. And that's fundamental to what the European Accessibility Act is trying to go through. And when you think about disability, so this social definition, it used to be a medical deficit-based one, but this is a social definition put forward by Sarah Horton and Whitney Quisenberry. That's a conflict between someone's functional capability and the world we create. If you build steps leading up to a door in the real world, you're choosing to exclude people who are going to be using wheels, be it someone pushing a buggy, someone having to push along a trolley with some goods on it, or someone in a wheelchair, or whatever it might be. Okay, these are things that it's a functional choice, that you're choosing to have steps rather than a ramp or a flat level. So you're basically having an ability plus a barrier manifest a disability. So this is all about removing that barrier. And when we think about just in general, now, not everyone knows that they have a disability. Not everyone regards what they have functionally as a disability. But in the last census, and this is from the NDA fact sheets, 1 in 5, more than 1 in 5 in people declared that they have a disability to a great or some extent. And that's huge. When you take into account 80% of students who leave school with dyslexia don't have a diagnosis. So they don't know. They might know there's something different about them, how they think, how they interact, but they might not know that it's a disability. So that's huge, and that's just one area. And you'll have many cases of that in your life. Probably you know that people who are colorblind but find out late. One of the key things when you're thinking about, well, if I do something, it's only helping a small group. That's not the case at all. This whole concept of the curb cut effect was, and this is an example from Barcelona, in America, they started having this cut in a curb between the road and the footpath to help increase employability of veterans with disabilities. But suddenly now it's everywhere. It's part of every type of crossing because it was something that benefited everyone. And suddenly you've got people with skateboards or whatever it is going up on these, people who are just walking, people who are cycling, whatever. It's making it help everybody in society. Closed captions, again, there was a reason behind it for supporting people with disabilities, but now you see them in sports bars where it's too noisy, but you might see the news or the commentating on the captions, or so many other ways that people are just using them now, watching TV while they're chatting to their friends, that kind of thing. Speech to text and text to speech, another one that was, these were specifically designed for a purpose around supporting people with disabilities, but now they're just everywhere. This is a screenshot of Google Translate, translating English to Finnish, so I could speak with someone who was a taxi driver when I was over in Helsinki. It wasn't intended for that, but that's removing a barrier of not just language, but then being able to understand and hear and being able to communicate in that language. So it's all about barriers. Let's think about barriers. So one of them is layout, how you structure pages, how you structure things in general. And having this consistent, predictable layout is really important. And in our accessibility training courses, we try and have a nice, consistent structure in every single course module that we do to have that. So they shouldn't have to figure out, how do I navigate this page? It's completely different than the previous one. You wouldn't want a building reconfiguring its corridors and its floors and its doors and numbering every time you go into it. Well, sometimes websites are a little bit like that too. And certainly learning management platforms, people have a plethora of different designs. But it's not just the structural layout, it's also the informational layout. This is just a few sentences in a paragraph giving guidance on what they should do in an assignment, something like that. Well, you add in a structure, you add in headings, you add in informational structure. Suddenly it's easier for everyone to read. It's easier for everyone to understand and go back to the key parts. You're even bullet pointing the important notes. So people with assistive technology or people visually looking at it are going to be able to benefit from this fundamental change. Here again with links, people often use like click here, read more, these generic links. It means that visually I need to read the stuff before it or afterwards to know where here is, or grammatically there is. The same with a URL. I don't know where that is going, but now you have a link saying subscribe to our newsletter or just newsletter as a link. Now you know where it is. It's basically like from the 80s and 90s, the Ron seal effect. It does what it says on the link. That's what it's about. It's about having information, but that applies to file names as well. Now, is this what your download folder might look like when you're taking an online course with my slides 4.pdf or slides 10.pdf, whatever it might be? These are names that aren't exactly specific, but you suddenly add in a date or a web for everyone or accessibility introduction presentation slides. They're meaningful. They're descriptive. And what about media? Earlier, I talked a little bit about the whole media and captions. And in this case, you have a gentleman here cupping his ears to try and hear because he's hard of hearing. And what about then someone using that media or listening to watching that video in a quiet library or wanting to print out a video? Ever printed out a song or printed out a video? It's, well, complex and expensive. You wouldn't want to have to print every single sort of page of it or instance where there's captions. But having a full text version of it, like a transcript, makes it printable so you can annotate it. Because annotating videos or a podcast, not exactly easy. And then you've got all of these different benefits. And it's not just one, it's many, including search engines. They prefer it because Google likes indexing text, not audio or video. And we will be sharing these slides along with the recording and stuff afterwards. So you can see that it's more. And here's another one. We have one about color. 1 in 10 approximately men are colorblind. 1 in 200 women are. Here you have words like presentation and project and in red-ish and intro and outcomes in a green. But for those who are fully colorblind, with red colorblind, presentation, project, intro and outcomes can be very similar. That's a lot, and it's something which we use color an awful lot in what we do because, well, it makes it look pretty, but it still needs to stand out from each other. So that's why they say don't use color alone. So all of these are examples of barriers, but here's one you see everywhere. People use sentences and paragraphs of all caps. Now, what it's done is, it's not the prettiest thing to try and read. It's slower for everybody, and all the words are rectangles. This makes it incredibly difficult for those with dyslexia, of which 1 in 10 in the population has dyslexia. You turn it into sentence case, it's more readable for everyone, easier to digest, although we know that it shouldn't be structured in a paragraph from 10 slides ago. But they're the kind of things which suddenly goes, oh, okay. These are just example of barriers. In this last one, we're not talking about sweets. Sweets aren't a barrier unless you're allergic to sugar or whatever it might be. But this is a typical online course with a box full of mints or PDFs just pouring out of it. But students have different needs. They don't just want one flavor of content. They want the green and white striped rectangular ones, the orange, the green, the yellow, the red sweets. They want audio, they want ebooks, they want Word documents, they want Braille files, depending on their need at that time. So you need to support choice and not lock down your content in a way that says, this is the only way I'm prepared to transfer that information, because you don't know what they need. So this is a journey from here to where you're going to, where you want to be compliant with your European Accessibility Act. And we're just going to go through a few slides sort of talking about some aspects of it, and especially thinking about the prior legal or legislation around it. So again, you will have the slides. The key part here is the 3 bullet points. Remove accessibility barriers. That's why we started talking about disability and barriers. Hard to talk about removing something if you don't know what they are, if you don't know examples of what they are. And all of those there are pretty easy to remove, but to enable people with disabilities to fully participate in society, that's so important. That's what underpins democracy. The next one here is more of a technical thing, but also it's about creating standards. It's this accessibility standards across the EU. And of course, standards can change and adapt and improve, and they constantly are. So once you're starting there, it's a commitment to keep with the standards. But the last part there is really important for all of your organizations, if you're any of the Learnovate members or working in this industry. If 96% of the top, whatever it was, 1 million websites, according to WebAIM, 96% are not fully accessible. If your systems are accessible, you've got an advantage, because between a choice of something they can't use and something they can, whoever that is, whatever age and capability they have, the system that will work is the one they'll use. So it's innovation, encouraging business to design accessible products and services from the start. Baked in accessibility. So I've got a few tables here just comparing between the older EU directive, which was really aimed at the public sector. And again, I've put a lot of text on these to talk around them, not to read them. But it was primarily public sector, where this European Act is a wide range of products and services across multiple sectors, physical things like ATMs and ticketing machines, and digital services and the digital online equivalent of those. But of course, then public sector websites and mobile apps was the original one. And there are exclusions. So if you're a small micro enterprise, as they call it, Brickfield are just now bigger than a micro enterprise. We're more than 10 people. So 10 people and below and under 2 million revenue, that's a micro enterprise, so that's excluded. But can you imagine if you want to compete in a market where everyone else is starting to do this? You might be legally excluded, but commercially, it's going to be a commercial imperative to do this. And then, of course, on the directive, it was more the private sector was excluded from that. So what about monitoring? Well, national authorities have to be involved in that. The original one, that there was going to be a body that would monitor and report on it. And this, for the European Accessibility Act, again, it was similar around that. But there might be declarations of conformity, might even be certification at some stage. And the key thing is it's aligned to standards, which may change and improve. You can't assume, oh, we're WCAG 2.1, we're fine. You're not fine, but you're where you are now, and you're going to have to constantly keep up to date with what's required, as you would want to. And this last part here is the most important message to take from this whole session. Training. Both of these, the one that aimed at public sector and then this one which goes across sectors in that way, it's about training and capacity building. It's about encouraging that. All of your staff should understand what accessibility is, why it's important, and how to be accessible in their emails, their social media, their documents, their product design, their collaborative, their customer support, all aspects of this, because that is really key. You need to live and breathe being accessible. When you're doing a presentation next, if you're using PowerPoint, you're going to use this present live option as well, because that helps people who have different languages or want to scan back through any of the slides, because Gavin's going quite quickly through them. So in the organizations, we've already talked about it, but the European Act focuses again on manufacturers, distributors, because it's also to do with those real world things, not just digital websites, and the service providers offering those products and services to consumers. This was key. You have to think about this in a different way. It's that B2C imperative as well as the B2B, business to consumer and business. And on the sectors, this brought it all in. Where the other one was public sector, and if you wanted to be delivering a product to them, you would want it to be accessible. Now suddenly banking, ICT, e-commerce, consumer electronics, all of these. So when you are flying from Ireland to England, you'll be going through all of these different systems, be it online and in the physical world, and all of those need to be accessible. And there's going to be penalties, and each country will determine them, and there will be fines, and there will also be jail time included for directors of companies who are simply just not doing this. You could also, even worse potentially than one person ending up in jail, your product could end up in a virtual jail being banned from the market because it's simply not operating in the correct way. In the States, there was nearly 5,000 legal cases taken last year. However, in Europe, it's not so much yet, but you can be sure that that's going to start coming after the European Accessibility Act. Complaints followed with legal action. So the reputational damage leading to loss of consumer trust and market share. Won't mention names, but there was one or two colleges who have been slapped on the wrist in Ireland for not supporting accessibility to the level that they should have. You don't want to be people getting that reputational damage, because reputational damage or market exclusion, those are penalties that will exceed the impact of fines. We are going to be sharing links to all of these other resources as well afterwards. And we have gone through this quite quickly, but if we want to look at the key takeaways for you today, it isn't just a legal requirement, but an opportunity. This is a business opportunity to do better, to reach more people. Using the EAA framework, you can then really make how you operate and what you do better to have a more inclusive company, ecosystem, and society. And although compliance is mandatory for some and many products and services, those others, if they want to compete in the space and be seen to be doing the right thing, have to step up as well. Laws don't only impact the people that they are directly aimed at. They impact the ecosystem, the market. They impact consumers' awareness. And for products, accessibility built into it. That's going to be key. Clear user interfaces, making it very straightforward, very simple, and compatible with assistive technologies, which means you're going to need to know, well, what is assistive technology? That's where the training and skills and capacity building come in. And for services, accessible information and customer support. Those bots, which one of my team was accused of being a bot today because the email went out promptly to the person. They're not a bot, I assure you. But accessible customer support is really important. Digital services, websites and apps meeting those standards now, but that will change. Keep on improving. Accessibility isn't something that you achieve and you stop. Accessibility becomes key for you. It becomes part of your DNA as an organization. So what do you do now? Capacity building, skills development. The what, the why, and the how. Really key. All of your staff, from the person who's answering your customer support, the whole way through your developers, your infrastructure people, everything. Include accessibility as a core business activity. You've got security specialists, privacy specialists. Now you make sure you have your accessibility specialists. It's in there at the beginning of every project, part of every meeting. Look at what you have, what you build, what your products, what your services, your infrastructure design. Monitor and audit them. And then don't just get a report and say, okay, resource the roadmap to get better. Make it integral to your organizational culture and practice accessibility day to day in how you operate. Like this session today, you've captions, you've translations, you've slides on your phone, you'll have a recording, you've the captions from the platform from Learnovate. All of that helps remove barriers. We don't know who has what barriers, but all of those will contribute to removing them for people. So I don't know if we've any questions, and obviously you've got a follow-up with that. If you want to contact me directly, I want to say there's a QR code there which you can go to, or just go to our website, brickfield.ie. I don't know if there was time for any questions, Louise or Dave.
Thank you, Gavin. We are going to move into the panel discussion, but feel free to take a look and chat there for any questions that you are in a position to answer. Thank you, Gavin, for that very insightful keynote on inclusive education for all and the very important elements of the European Accessibility Act. Some great guidance there for our attendees today. Thank you, everyone, for participating in our event poll today, which asked the question, how familiar are you with the European Accessibility Act? And some really interesting results from the poll. Very honest audience today, where 0% are not in any way very familiar with the Act, 34% somewhat familiar, 51% have heard of it but don't know much about it. Hopefully you do after today's Link and Learn with Learnovate. And 14.6% are not familiar at all. Again, hopefully you're becoming familiar after our event today. And now we welcome our panel chair, Joanne, to the stage, along with our panelists, Jean, Fran and Margaret. Thank you, folks, for joining us. I'm going to pass over to you, Joanne.
Thanks, Dave. I think Margaret is joining us in a bit, so we will wait in anticipation for that. But I just want to commend Gavin on his keynote. I really enjoyed it as well. And I particularly enjoyed the practical examples you gave at the start, Gavin, and the barriers to just really exemplify the kind of the way in which kind of universal design and universal access is just it was a perfect example of a lens in which just to look at whether it's business, education, public or private, and to allow it to underpin every decision that you make. So I thought that was really well done. And I think it was quite clear that the challenges that are faced from say me working in the education field are shared in the private corporate world as well. So a lot of the issues that you described, I was nodding to, even though we're coming from two very different fields. And I also think, legislation often strikes fear into people, but a lot of what you described was shifts in culture, attitudes, and strong leadership. So I think that should act as comfort to people that when, a lot of the stuff that you're describing, people are doing already, but that this can act as a kind of a way in which to guide decision making. So thanks a million for that. My name is Joanne. I'm a lecturer in inclusive education in the School of Education in Trinity College. And I'm going to chair the panel discussion here today. And I'm really honoured to have Fran, Heathorn and Reale from Immaculate and Cobblestone Learning. And I'm going to get both of them. These are experts in their field, and I don't think I do them justice by introducing them. So Fran, I might start with you. Maybe you could introduce yourself. Thanks,
Joanne. My name's Fran Heathorn. I'm creative lead for an e-learning agency called Cobblestone Learning. So I have a background in graphic design and multimedia design. I've worked in television. I've been working in e-learning for 15 years or so. So accessibility has definitely been on my radar for quite a while now.
Brilliant. Thanks a million. And Jean?
Thanks, Joanne. My name is Jean Reale, and I'm an assistant professor in academic practice at Immaculate College. And for almost 30 years now, I've been involved in inclusive education and particularly around assistive technology as well.
Brilliant. And thanks a million. And over the next little while, we'd really just like to get into some of the issues that Gavin has raised and maybe discuss options both in the public and private, in education and in business, around where universal access, European Accessibility Act and universal design and where they come in, and no better people to be asking those questions too. But Fran, I might start with you, if that's okay. In relation to what Gavin said about the Act, how does the Act influence digital learning environments in your view?
Well, everything that Gavin was saying was resonating with me. A lot of what he's saying about how this benefits everybody, not just people with disabilities, I think that's really true. And I certainly use a lot of the assistive technologies myself, like read aloud screens and things when I'm having to go through documents. So I'm fully behind this Act, and I think it's really great that it's going to come into force. So the Act covers lots of things. Like Gavin was saying, it's not just the digital environment, it's physical environments like ATMs and ticket machines and things like that. So it's really just the digital part that will affect our industry. But everything that is covered in the Act has kind of been there in the WCAG Web Accessibility Guidelines that we've been following for years anyway. So I'm not too concerned about it. And I'm actually really hopeful that this Act coming in is going to mean that the tools that we use will have to be accessible, because at the moment we have to put a lot of workarounds in place to make sure that the courses we make are accessible to people, especially for our clients in the public sector. So it's just, as Gavin was saying, things like making sure everything's compatible with screen readers, making sure that you have closed captions or transcripts, watching color contrast, descriptive alt tags for images and things like that. So there's a lot to remember, but there's lots that you can do to make sure that what you do is accessible. We can come to that later, or I can elaborate depending how you want to go with this.
No, that's fine. And I think there is a lot to remember, but a little bit like what came through, I think, in the keynote is that if it informs your every decision, you often don't have to remember, because it just underpins your decision-making process. So yeah, maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later. Jean, can I move on to you in regards to the kind of pedagogical frameworks that could be aligned with something like this new Act?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose within Ireland over the last couple of years in particular, we've been very aware of universal design for learning. And universal design is really what we're looking at here. It's about that idea of designing for all. And a lot of the times people get worried about, the impact of on their work on making things accessible. But actually, if you design from the outset, you're minimizing those barriers, and what you're actually doing is you're future-proofing it. Where accessibility becomes an issue is that if you're trying to retrofit it, because that creates all sorts of problems. So like, I really welcome the fact, because what it's doing is it's getting us to sit down and to actually plan, you know, and not to have to react, because at the end of the day, you know, access is a right, it's not a gift. And we need to look at what we're doing. And if we take the Universal Design for Learning framework and we apply it to what we're doing, and we look at the 3 key principles, you're talking about multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. And if we apply those principles to everything that we do, then we are automatically targeting the widest possible audience. And the thing around the technical pieces, you know, that's sometimes where I think a lot of people worry about it. And, you know, what Fran was talking about there and what Gavin was talking about earlier, you know, adding captioning, adding transcripts, all that. Initially, people, you know, are kind of fearful of that. But as we know, the technology has moved on, and it's actually quite easy for us to do it. And if it's something that you're doing constantly, it just becomes part of your everyday routine, you know. But it is just about not, as Gavin did say earlier, you know, it's not about, oh, we're dealing with this 20%. We're not, we're dealing with everybody. And as I said, you're looking at the cohort we have in front of us at this current moment, who we may or may not understand all of their needs. But if we design in this way, it doesn't matter. We don't need to know it in advance, because we've already prepared for them. So as I said, using the universal design framework to have that mindset of design, to look at designing for all, and as I said, to future-proof what we're doing as well. It's really important.
That's brilliant, Jean, and so well explained as well. There's so many, I can't see the attendees, but I'm sure they're nodding as well, but I'm certainly nodding at what you're saying. Mags, thanks for joining us. Could I ask you just firstly, before I fire a question at you, could you just introduce yourself today?
Hi everyone, my name is Mags Flood, and I am an assistant professor in inclusive and special education in Maynooth University. The reason I'm here today is because of my experience in Universal Design for Learning and my contribution to the review of the new 3.0 guidelines.
Great. Well, you've just teed me up nicely for the question that I was going to ask you. So Jean alluded to the fact that in Ireland over the past number of years, there's been quite significant interest and engagement with UDL, but we also know that within the UDL framework, there's been some changes. Could you just describe that to us, what the changes are and what do you think made them come about?
Yeah, just going back to what everyone else has said about this being for all and being for everyone, there was a recognition within the 2.2 guidelines that they were still disability focused, they were disability heavy, and therefore a lot of the time it went back to that physical access, and it didn't go beyond that. It didn't go on to access to everything, and it didn't think about the person. In 3.0, one of the key changes is that we have to acknowledge and recognize identity within diversity and variability. And what that means is that we have to think about the who. So we can't just go 80%, 20%. We have to go 100%. And who are the people? Who are the individuals within that 100%? So whether we are designing with the new Act in mind for shops, for digital, for airports, for restaurants, or we're designing for the learning community, we think about the physical environment, but we also think about our interactions and our engagement. So for example, is the content, so we can get into the room, but is the information in the room accessible to everybody? Is the information or the visuals in the room representative of everybody? Can we ask, can we find somebody who will be able to respond to my needs, to the who in what I'm doing? So that's the biggest change. And from that, we're moving to recognizing biases, and we all have subconscious biases, and that's okay. But it's about recognize them when we are designing. so that we can reduce those barriers. And obviously it starts with the individual, but it goes right up to systems barriers, just like not having access to captions, which everyone has access to. But if we don't train people how to use them, how to turn them on, then we're back to the bias. We may have physically put something in place, but we're still excluding people. So we have to go back to that who and what they need.
Amazing. It's such a reflective process, really, what you're describing there. And thanks for doing it so clearly, Max, because I know it's actually quite a complex thing to describe. Jean, I might move back to you and just discuss, just from a kind of a higher education or further education, just thinking in terms of educational institutions, how well prepared do you think they are, or we are, for the requirements under the Act?
Well, the way I wouldn't do a sort of a blanket answer to that, because we really need to look at it in terms of where people are on that journey. And the thing is that we are all striving for fully inclusive learning environments, but the reality is that we are at very different stages. So I think for anybody who's listening in, whether it is a commercial venture or whether it is an educational venture that you're involved in, you know, we need to actually just sit back and do an actual analysis of where we're at, because we are doing a lot of accessible practice, but that may not be consistent across all of our endeavors. So our kind of starting point really is to look at this as a project and say, right, okay, where are we currently at? What are we currently doing that's working? What are we not doing that's not working? And how do we bridge that gap? So what we need to do then is bring that collective thinking into play and have everybody involved in it, because, you know, as we all say, you know, that inclusion is everybody's business, and it is. And I think that's one of the things here that's really important, is that, you know, it's not about, as Mags was talking about, you know, it's not just the physical access. It's not just the learning experience. It's our whole experience as part of our learning journey that we need to ensure that we have those conversations, that everybody is on the same page with this and that they're building towards it. So what we need to do is we need to have a structure within our institutions. We need to have lead people who are working on this continuously. And the one thing that we don't want to fall into is this idea of we're compliant now. Because there's no such thing, because things are constantly changing. So we need to have that, again, go back to that idea of that design mindset, that we're constantly thinking of, well, what's coming up next? How can we make this better? And that's what we're striving to do all the time.
Excellent. Thanks a million, Jean. And it's so very true, because I think that's what I was trying to get at that point in relation to legislation can often strike fear into people, but we don't want that. We don't want to be compliant or not compliant, and that to be the kind of attitude or focus of people. So excellent. Fran, I might come back to you if that's okay. Could you describe, do you think, the common accessibility challenges faced in designing, because we've talked a lot about design here, in designing those inclusive education experiences?
Yeah, I think what I was saying at the end there about there being a lot to remember, I think that it's just, yeah, I mean, we have sort of checklists to follow. We have them at lots of different stages in our design process. So so when you're building it, but also when you're reviewing it, and then accessibility checklists for when people are QAing, of course, there's I think that helps, is just having a list of things and running through it a lot, because there's so much to remember that you often do forget things. And sometimes it's simple things that isn't really a limitation of any software or anything. It's just things like trying to put yourself in the shoes, like Jean was saying, of the person who's going to be taking this course. It can be really difficult if you are able-bodied and you don't have a problem distinguishing with color, or you don't have a problem with background music being distracting. It's very hard to notice these things. So that's why I think the checklists are useful. And also continuously improving. So a lot of our courses will send out for an external accessibility review, especially if it's for a public sector client. And things might come back like you haven't described the screen. So even though you've put the accessible sort of mitigation in place, you haven't told someone that it's there. So even if it's like, oh, there's 3 things to sort into 2 categories, if you don't tell somebody that there's 3 things to sort into 2 categories and just say sort these things into the correct categories, then people who can't see won't know to go looking for those categories or for how many times they're going to have to repeat the experience. So I think that there's lots of easy ways to slip up like that you can forget about, but also lots of ways around those things as well.
And for institutions, do you think beginning their kind of accessibility journey, people who are at the start of this, could you advise or recommend, say, low cost, kind of high impact strategies that they could adopt? First steps.
Yeah, I think the same as Jean said, the first thing to do is to assess what you're doing in terms of accessibility, like do an audit and say what you're doing well and what you need to improve on, or areas where you might not be compliant with the new act. You can also consult with external experts. We use a company called Interaccess who are very good, who will run through everything you're doing and give you a report and tell you where you need to improve. That can be useful. Checklists, I'd say they're really useful, and having them at different stages in your process, and developing systems. So just making sure that everybody knows that you're doing this as a company, and enforcing it. So having a kind of review process in place to make sure, and devoting time specifically to those accessibility considerations. I'd say those would be where to start.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, and I think leadership is really key there as well. Just kind of open commitment to the kind of inclusivity agenda. But I might open this next question out to. So actually, I'll go back to you, Mags, if that's okay. If just in relation to next steps or early steps in this journey, do you think there's any key resources or training opportunities for educators that they could kind of begin this journey or begin to understand a little bit more about accessibility in education?
There is, and the first place to start is in-house. It's look for the good practices that are already happening. So whether you're an educational institute or you're a commercial business, there are good practices, normally at individual level. So go reach out and find out what they are. There's loads of free resources. So in terms of Universal Design for Learning, CAST, the designers, have a free webinar on each of their principles, and they have a webinar on identity and who as well. At a local level, something that has been really successful to the point where we're doing it for a second year here in Maynooth University is we ran a UDL and U campaign. So we literally got 4 fellows together, shared our experiences, created some resources, and invited people into 30-minute meetings with us where we shared something and asked them to share. So it doesn't have to be a really expensive thing. You start small, and I think if you start and get the buy-in, then it's worth spending the money on bringing external resources in. But start and have the buy-in before you do that.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that the initiatives that you're taking are about human collaboration and connection and making the leap and overcoming your own individual fears, much less institutional fears.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks so much, Mags. And I would like to offer this next question just in relation to the whole panel, just in terms of the first steps that educators and institutions should take to align with the European Accessibility Act. And Jean, I might just go to you first in response to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, one of the big things, Joanna, is the launch of the Altitude Charter last year, which is the UD Charter for tertiary education. And I think that's a really strong support for us, because what it does is it gives us a roadmap of how to look at UD right across the 4 pillars, and one of them being the technology environment. And I think it's a really good, strong set of guidelines to help us. There's also a toolkit that goes with it that will give you ideas and suggestions around how to approach this, how to build your team. So I think that's a really good starting point for institutions to look at the Altitude UD Charter, because it does guide us. One of the things I'd just like to go back to there as well about the design piece as well, particularly from the educational sector, is that we need to ensure that our students are involved in this design piece, because it's that idea of designing for instead of with. So we need to ensure that we have all of the stakeholders involved in this design piece, and particularly for something like accessibility, it's that personal experience is really what drives this. You know, it's when it comes down to, do we change the door? How much does the door cost? Well, actually, how much does it cost in human value? You know, we need to look at it in those sort of terms. So it's very much about that. So as I said, there's a lot of guiding pieces out there. We also have the UDL digital badge, which is rolled out nationally every year. And this year, there was a rollout of a second badge, which is a UD Beyond the Classroom, which supports non-teaching staff who are student-facing. So there are a lot of resources that are there that are freely available to institutions to look at.
Brilliant. Mags, I might move to you in relation to the Charter. How important it is from a policy perspective that institutions have these kind of frameworks in which to adopt, do you think?
Well, before the Charter, we had nothing. So like, start with that when you're trying to do something and you have nothing to support you. So at least now you have this document and you have the toolkit, and it's going to give you that guidance. And even going back to what we said earlier about just seeing what we're already doing well, the first thing I would do with that Charter is do that audit, get the voice of everyone within that environment, whether it's a learning or a business environment. Get everyone's voice. And then the teacher in me is really going to come out here now, but do 2 stars and a wish. Look at what we're doing well first, and then look at what we can do to improve. And if we go back to the Charter for that improve part, that's going to signpost, and that's going to give us things that we can consider and practical tips that we can put in place as well.
Brilliant, thanks. And Fran, I just might kind of finish up my questioning with you, just in relation to what Jean mentioned there about involving the learners in the design. And in your case, that might be slightly a different type of learner, perhaps, to the learners we're referring to. Is that an important part of your process as well?
Oh, it definitely is. Yeah, to get that user testing is really key, I think, because it's so difficult to see sometimes. If you don't have that disability, it's almost impossible to notice some things. So yeah, definitely, we always ask for user testing for people with disabilities to run through it and give us any feedback on where it can be improved.
Brilliant.
There was just one thing, thing I didn't mention so far, and Jean reminded me of it when she was talking about cost. There is an associated cost with making sure that things are accessible, and we can't ignore that. So the way that we approach that is to have a sort of a tiered approach where we make sure that we've committed to say that everything that we make is going to be accessible. But then we do offer additional sort of enhanced accessibility, like sign language, all these transcripts with descriptions of what's going on in the video visually, as well as just the text in, the script. So it gives a little bit of flexibility there. So you are compliant, but then you can be like super as well, and have that kind of opportunity.
Yeah, excellent. I think it's really interesting, the three commentators today. I think there's a lot more similarities, I think, in the conversation than perhaps I would have expected in terms of just crossing over that public-private piece. But I think what's come across really clear from what you said is the kind of, everyone's at a very different stage, and that's okay in their kind of journey towards accessibility and inclusive education. And hopefully that will kind of allay any of the fears that people feel, I think, a lot of the time, that they aren't doing enough. So I think that's really important. From what you have said as well, and it's related to my last point, is that history often guides where we excel, but also where we have gaps in how much we have developed inclusive practice and accessibility. And that's okay too. But once we have an awareness of those gaps and we know where we're going with them, and hopefully things like the UD Charter, the Altitude Charter, can help guide and scaffold, where it needs attention and where we're actually doing okay. And a lot of the time, I think it's reassuring for practitioners and educators to know that a lot of what they do is universally designed, but perhaps it's just with intention from now on. I think the significance of the Charter in guiding this intentional design is really, really important. So I'd probably like to finish on that point. But equally, somebody mentioned to me many years ago that legislation such as this Act, it can often just act as the baseline. And there's nothing wrong with going far and above what the legislation is demanding or requiring of you. And hopefully we won't have to ever get into penalties and discussions like that, because we will be overachieving from what the legislation is asking of us. So I think there's some really nice examples of that around the country, and I think we've hopefully exemplified some of that today. So thanks so much to the panel. You've been fantastic, and I'll hand back over to you, Dave.
Thank you, everyone, for a really engaging panel discussion. Today has been our most attended Link and Learn, with over 100 attendees live at today's event. So thank you so much for your participation. We will be sharing support materials with you, as well as posting the video in our YouTube channel. And just to mention, the link to our latest Inside Learning podcast is in the chat now. A huge thank you to Gavin, Joanne, Jean, Fran and Margaret for sharing their expertise today. Our next Link and Learn is on the 15th of May, so please keep an eye on our LinkedIn and our regular communications for more details. If any of you would like to speak to us about our accessibility research or joining the Learnovate community, please do not hesitate to get in touch. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks.